In the dead of night on May 1, 2011, two modified Black Hawk helicopters sliced through the darkness over Pakistan, carrying a cargo more precious than gold and more dangerous than dynamite. Inside those aircraft sat 24 of America's most elite warriors, men whose names would never appear in newspapers, whose faces would never grace magazine covers, yet whose mission that night would change the course of history forever. They were Navy SEALs from the legendary Red Squadron, and they were about to pull off the most audacious military operation of the 21st century. For nearly 10 years, the world's most wanted man had vanished into the shadows like a ghost. Osama bin Laden, the architect of September 11th, had seemingly disappeared from the face of the earth. Intelligence agencies across the globe had spent billions of dollars, deployed thousands of operatives, and followed countless dead ends in their relentless pursuit. Yet here he was, hiding in plain sight in a compound just miles from Pakistan's premier military academy, protected by walls and secrecy, believing himself untouchable. But on this night, that illusion would be shattered forever. The helicopters cutting through Pakistani airspace were not ordinary aircraft. These were ghost machines, stealth-modified Black Hawks that represented years of classified development and billions of dollars in cutting-edge technology. Their rotors whispered rather than roared, their surfaces absorbed radar waves like hungry shadows, and their very existence was known only to the most elite special operations units on Earth. The pilots at the controls had each logged over a decade of experience flying these phantom birds in the world's most dangerous combat zones. Behind them, strapped into jump seats, sat the cream of America's special forces, Red Squadron operators who had been hand-picked not just for their lethal skills, but for their psychological resilience and tactical brilliance. These were men who had survived the most brutal selection process in the military, where the attrition rate regularly exceeded 50%, and where mental toughness mattered as much as physical prowess. Almost every operator on this mission had completed 10 or more combat deployments to Afghanistan. They were warriors forged in the fires of a decade of continuous warfare. The mission they were embarking on had no official name at first, existing only in the classified corridors of the Pentagon and the situation rooms of intelligence agencies, but when it finally received its designation, the symbolism was unmistakable. Operation Neptunespear. Neptune's trident appears on the Navy's special warfare insignia, a fitting emblem for the men who were about to wield America's sharpest weapon against its most elusive enemy. The path to this moment had begun almost immediately after the towers fell in New York City. While the world watched in horror and disbelief, intelligence operatives were already beginning the painstaking work of tracking down those responsible. They knew from the very beginning that bin Laden operated through a network of trusted couriers, men who carried his messages across borders and through mountain passes, maintaining his connection to the terrorist network he had built. For years, these ghost messengers remained just that, ghosts, names without faces, voices without bodies, shadows that intelligence analysts could sense but never quite grasp. The breakthrough came when American spies finally identified one of bin Laden's most trusted couriers, a man known as Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. This courier had been extraordinarily careful, employing every tradecraft technique to remain invisible to the surveillance networks that were hunting him. But in August of 2010, after years of patient observation, CIA operatives finally located al-Kuwaiti. They watched him, followed him, studied his patterns and his routes, and like a thread pulled from a vast tapestry, he led them to something extraordinary. Deep in the Pakistani city of Abbottabad, he disappeared into a compound unlike anything intelligence analysts had ever seen. The compound was massive, sprawling across an area 3 times larger than any other home in the neighborhood. Its walls rose 18 feet high, topped with barbed wire that glinted menacingly in the sunlight. Security cameras watched every approach, and the entire structure seemed designed not for comfort, but for concealment. Most telling of all, the people who lived inside had no visible means of income, no jobs that could explain their ability to afford such an elaborate fortress. Intelligence analysts pored over satellite images, studying every detail of the mysterious compound. They mapped its courtyards, counted its windows, analyzed the patterns of life within its walls. By September of 2010, they had reached a startling conclusion. This compound had been custom-built to hide someone of extraordinary importance, someone who commanded the resources to construct a fortress and the paranoia to demand such extreme security measures. The more they studied the compound, the more convinced they became. This was where the world's most wanted terrorist had been hiding in plain sight, living just miles from Pakistan's most prestigious military academy, protected by walls and secrecy, while the world's intelligence agencies searched the caves and mountains of Afghanistan. But knowing where bin Laden was hiding was only the beginning. Getting to him would require a mission so audacious, so precisely executed, that even the slightest error could result in international catastrophe. Pakistan was a nuclear-armed ally, and conducting a military operation on their soil without permission could trigger a diplomatic crisis of unprecedented proportions. The target was heavily defended, located in a populated area where civilian casualties were a constant concern. This was not a mission for conventional forces. This required the most elite warriors America could field, men trained to operate in the shadows, to strike with surgical precision, and to vanish before their enemies could respond. The mission demanded operators who could adapt instantly to changing circumstances, who could maintain their composure under the most extreme pressure, and who could execute complex tactics in complete darkness. Admiral William McRaven, the commander of Joint Special Operations Command, personally selected the unit that would carry out this historic mission. His choice fell upon Red Squadron from SEAL Team 6, also known by their classified designation as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. These were not just any Navy SEALs. They were the SEALs who hunted other special operations forces, the operators called upon when conventional special forces were not enough. Red Squadron was just returning from a deployment in Afghanistan, which provided the perfect cover for their selection. They could be redirected without attracting unwanted attention, without triggering the curiosity of intelligence agencies from other nations. The operators McRaven chose were the most experienced and senior members of the squadron, men whose skills had been proven in dozens of high-risk operations across multiple war zones. The selection criteria went beyond combat experience. These operators needed language skills for cross-border operations into Pakistan. They needed the psychological profile to handle a mission where failure meant not just death, but international humiliation for the United States. They needed the tactical expertise to adapt instantly when their carefully laid plans inevitably collided with the chaos of combat. What happened next would test every skill these elite warriors possessed, challenge every aspect of their training, and ultimately prove that sometimes a handful of the right people can indeed shock the world. The training that followed was unlike anything these elite operators had ever experienced. Without being told the exact nature of their target, the 24 SEALs were transported to a restricted facility at Harvey Point defense testing activity in North Carolina. There, behind razor wire and security checkpoints that kept out even the most senior military officials, they discovered something that took their breath away. Rising from the forest floor like a movie set was a perfect replica of the Abbottabad compound. Every wall, every window, every door had been recreated with obsessive attention to detail. Intelligence analysts had studied thousands of satellite images, measuring shadows and calculating dimensions until they could reproduce the target with millimeter precision. The SEALs would train on this mock-up until they could navigate its corridors blindfolded, until every corner and stairway was burned into their muscle memory. But the training didn't stop there. The entire team was then relocated to Nevada, where another replica awaited them at 4,000 feet of elevation. This wasn't just attention to detail, it was tactical genius. The altitude in Abbottabad could affect helicopter performance, and the mission planners wanted to test every variable that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. The Nevada facility used shipping containers crudely fashioned into the compound's shape, but it served its purpose perfectly. Day after day, night after night, the SEALs rehearsed their assault. They practiced fast roping from helicopters, breaching doors, clearing rooms, and most critically, they drilled helicopter crash scenarios until they were sick of them. The operators had no idea how prophetic this training would prove to be. An unnamed Navy source would later reveal that they conducted so many downed helicopter drills that the operators were simply exhausted by the repetition. The final phase of training took place at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, where intelligence operatives had constructed yet another full-scale replica on a restricted section known as Camp Alpha. Here, surrounded by the very mountains where bin Laden had once hidden, the SEALs refined their tactics under conditions identical to those they would face on the actual mission. It was during this final training phase that the operators first laid eyes on the aircraft that would carry them to their destiny. When they rounded the corner and saw the stealth Black Hawks for the first time, even these hardened warriors were stunned into silence. Robert O'Neill, one of the team leaders, would later describe his reaction with a mixture of awe and dark humor. The helicopters looked like something from a science fiction movie, their angular surfaces and modified rotors unlike anything in the conventional military inventory. These were not the standard Black Hawks that had carried American forces into combat for decades. These were ghost machines, aircraft that had been developed in the deepest black programs of the defense establishment. Their design incorporated lessons learned from the cancelled Comanche helicopter program and other classified projects. The modifications were so extensive that they fundamentally changed how the aircraft flew, making them quieter, harder to detect on radar, but also more challenging to control. The stealth technology came at a price. Every ounce of weight had to be calculated precisely. The additional equipment that made the helicopters invisible to enemy sensors also made them heavier and less maneuverable than their conventional counterparts. The pilots who would fly these machines had been selected just as carefully as the SEALs they would carry. Each had over a decade of experience flying stealth helicopters in combat, navigating by night vision goggles through mountain valleys where a single mistake meant death. As the final preparations were completed, the magnitude of what they were attempting began to sink in. This was not just a military operation, it was a geopolitical gamble of staggering proportions. They would be flying deep into Pakistani airspace without permission, conducting a raid just miles from a major military installation in a country armed with nuclear weapons. If captured, they could trigger an international crisis. If the mission failed, the consequences could reshape American foreign policy for generations. The intelligence picture continued to evolve, even as the operators prepared for launch. Surveillance teams had been watching the compound for months, noting the patterns of life within its walls. They observed a tall man who appeared regularly in the courtyard, walking in circles for exercise, always careful to remain hidden from overhead observation. The man they dubbed the Pacer matched bin Laden's height and build, but positive identification remained impossible. Analysis of the compound revealed other crucial details. The building's unusual construction included multiple courtyards that would complicate the assault. The walls were reinforced far beyond normal residential standards. Most telling of all, the occupants burned their trash rather than putting it out for collection, suggesting they were desperate to hide any evidence of their presence from intelligence collection. The final mission brief took place in a secure facility where even the most senior military officials needed special clearance to enter. Maps covered the walls, showing approach routes, contingency plans, and extraction points. Weather forecasts were analyzed with obsessive precision because cloud cover could mean the difference between stealth and detection. Intelligence updates flowed in until the final moments before departure, as analysts refined their understanding of the target and its defenses. On April 27, 2011, the assault team boarded their aircraft for the flight that would change history. The mood among the operators was calm, professional, focused. These were men who had been preparing for this moment their entire adult lives. They checked their weapons one final time, reviewed their assignments, and settled into the mental space that would carry them through the next few hours. The helicopters lifted off from Jalalabad under cover of complete darkness, their stealth modifications rendering them nearly invisible to the Pakistani radar systems that swept the border. As they crossed into Pakistani airspace, every man aboard understood that they were now committed to a course of action that would either end in triumph or disaster. There would be no turning back, no second chances, no opportunity to revise their plans once the shooting started. Below them, the Pakistani countryside rolled past in shades of green and grey, visible only through night vision equipment. Villages dotted the landscape, their inhabitants sleeping peacefully, unaware that history was passing overhead in the form of two whisper-quiet helicopters, carrying America's most lethal warriors toward their appointment with the world's most wanted terrorist. The compound appeared in their night vision scopes like a medieval fortress dropped into suburban Pakistan. As the stealth Black Hawks descended toward their target, the pilots fought against the unique challenges these modified aircraft presented. The additional weight from stealth equipment, combined with the hot and humid conditions, created a flight environment that pushed both machines and men to their limits. The lead helicopter, call sign Chalk 1, approached the compound's eastern wall with surgical precision, but as it descended into the confined space, the aerodynamics that had been carefully calculated in training began to betray them. The solid concrete walls of the actual compound created air currents that had not been replicated in their mock-up training sites, which had used chain-link fencing. The helicopter's advanced rotor system, modified for stealth, struggled against the hot cushion of disturbed air. What happened next would have ended most military operations before they began. The pilot felt his aircraft becoming unstable, the controls responding sluggishly as the machine settled toward the ground faster than intended. In the passenger compartment, the SEALs felt the aircraft's distress through their seats, recognizing immediately that they were going down. But these were not ordinary soldiers facing an ordinary crisis. The helicopter struck the compound's courtyard in what aviation experts would later call a controlled crash. The tail rotor caught the wall, spinning the aircraft around as it settled heavily to earth. Dust and debris filled the air as the rotor blades shattered against concrete and stone. In those crucial seconds, as metal screamed and sparks flew, the mission hung in the balance. But the months of crash drills paid off in ways that training manuals could never capture. Before the dust had settled, the SEALs were already moving. They flowed out of the damaged aircraft like water finding its level, weapons ready, formation intact, minds focused not on what had gone wrong but on what needed to happen next. The helicopter was down, but the mission was very much alive. The second helicopter, witnessing the crash of its partner, immediately adapted to the new reality. Rather than landing in the courtyard as planned, the pilot set down outside the compound walls, deploying his team of operators to breach the perimeter from an entirely different angle. This was improvisation at the highest level, tactical flexibility that separated elite units from conventional forces. Inside the compound, the sound of the crash had shattered the night's silence. The occupants, who had lived for years in a carefully maintained bubble of security, suddenly found their sanctuary violated by forces they could barely comprehend. Lights flickered on in windows as confusion and panic spread through the buildings. The SEALs moved with lethal precision through the compound's maze-like layout. Their night vision equipment turned darkness into an advantage, allowing them to see clearly while their enemies stumbled through shadows. The operators had memorized every detail of this compound structure during their months of training, and now that knowledge became their tactical edge. The first contact came at the Guesthouse, where Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the courier whose trail had led intelligence agencies to this moment, made his final stand. The door was locked, and as the SEALs prepared to breach it with explosive charges, gunfire erupted from within. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets punched through the wooden door, forcing the operators to take cover. The firefight was brief but intense. The SEALs returned fire with controlled precision, their training allowing them to maintain discipline even as bullets whined past their heads. When the shooting stopped, they found al-Kuwaiti dead behind the door, his weapon still clutched in his hands. A woman emerged carrying a child, followed by other children, their faces frozen in terror at the violence that had shattered their world. The operators moved methodically through the main building, clearing each floor with the systematic thoroughness that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises. On the first floor, they encountered the second courier and his wife. The man reached for a weapon, and the SEALs cut him down before he could bring it to bear. The woman died in the crossfire, another casualty of the violence that surrounded those who chose to harbor the world's most wanted terrorist. As they advanced up the stairway to the second floor, the SEALs encountered Khalid bin Laden, one of Osama's sons. The young man was armed and positioned at the top of the stairs, but his courage could not overcome the tactical superiority of the operators ascending toward him. He fell under their precise gunfire, his weapon clattering down the steps as his body collapsed. Throughout the building, the sound of gunfire echoed off concrete walls and through narrow corridors, But this was not the chaotic spray and pray shooting of amateur fighters. This was the controlled, disciplined application of lethal force by professionals who had trained for this moment their entire adult lives. Every shot was deliberate, every movement calculated, every decision made with the cold precision that separated these operators from every other military unit on Earth. On the third floor, behind a door that had remained closed throughout the violence below, the world's most wanted terrorist made his own final preparations. For nearly 10 years, Osama bin Laden had lived in the shadow of his own legend, protected by layers of security and the assumption that his enemies could never find him. Now, as the sound of gunfire grew closer, that assumption was revealed as the deadly illusion it had always been. The SEALs reached the final stairway, their movements deliberate and coordinated. They had come too far and overcome too much to allow anything to prevent them from completing their mission. Behind them lay a trail of violence and destruction. Ahead lay the culmination of nearly a decade of hunting, the moment when America's longest manhunt would finally reach its conclusion. The door to bin Laden's bedroom stood before them like a portal between two eras. On one side lay the age of terrorism and fear that had defined the early 21st century. On the other side lay justice, retribution, and the end of a chapter in American history that had begun with the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York City. As the operators prepared to breach that final barrier, they carried with them the weight of national purpose, the memories of nearly 3,000 innocent victims, and the hopes of a country that had never stopped believing in the power of its warriors to reach anywhere in the world and touch anyone who threatened American lives. The final moments of the raid were approaching, and with them, the completion of a mission that would demonstrate once again that some forces in this world should never be underestimated, and some sanctuaries are never truly safe from the long arm of American justice. What happened next in that third-floor bedroom would send shockwaves around the globe, validate years of patient intelligence work, and prove that even in an age of technological warfare, sometimes the most important missions still come down to a handful of elite warriors willing to risk everything for their country and their cause. The final breach came with surgical precision. The SEALs flowed through the doorway like shadows given form, their movements coordinated through years of training that had become instinct. In the darkness of that third-floor bedroom, illuminated only by the green glow of night vision equipment, they found him, the man who had orchestrated the murder of 3,000 innocent Americans, who had declared war on civilization itself, stood before them in the final seconds of his reign of terror. Osama bin Laden reached for a weapon, but his movements were those of a man who had grown soft in his years of hiding. The SEALs who faced him were warriors at the peak of their deadly craft, operators whose reflexes had been honed by a decade of continuous combat. The confrontation lasted mere heartbeats. A single shot above the left eye ended the life of the world's most wanted terrorist, sending his body crashing to the floor of the compound that had been his sanctuary and would now become his tomb. The team leader's voice crackled over the radio with words that would echo through history. "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo." The code phrase that signaled mission success, the end of a manhunt that had consumed the resources of the most powerful nation on Earth for nearly 10 years. In that moment, justice had finally caught up with the architect of September 11th. But even as bin Laden's body lay motionless on the floor, the mission was far from over. The SEALs had been granted 40 minutes to complete their objective and extract, but what they discovered in that compound would extend their timeline and provide intelligence that would reshape the global war on terror. One operator alerted command that they had found a treasure trove of computers, electronics, and documents that could unlock the secrets of al-Qaeda's global network. The original timeline stretched as the SEALs worked frantically to collect every piece of intelligence they could carry. Hard drives, computers, thumb drives, notebooks, and videotapes were stuffed into bags and slung around their necks. They grabbed bin Laden's personal diary, volumes of correspondence, and storage devices that would later reveal nearly 500,000 computer files totaling over 200 gigabytes of intelligence. Meanwhile, outside the compound, the crashed stealth helicopter presented its own challenge. The aircraft's classified technology could not be allowed to fall into foreign hands. As a backup Chinook helicopter arrived to extract the assault team, the SEALs prepared to destroy the damaged machine. Explosive charges reduced most of the aircraft to twisted metal and scattered debris, but the tail section survived the demolition, its classified modifications exposed to the world when Pakistani forces arrived at dawn. In less than 40 minutes, 24 men had accomplished what the combined intelligence apparatus of the world's most powerful nations had failed to achieve for nearly a decade. They had penetrated the most secure airspace in South Asia, overcome a helicopter crash that should have doomed their mission, adapted to circumstances that would have shattered lesser units, and eliminated the single most wanted terrorist in human history. Operation Neptune Spear stands as testament to what happens when elite warriors, cutting-edge technology, and unwavering national resolve converge on a single point of focus. The world had been shocked not by the size of the force that brought justice to Osama bin Laden, but by the deadly precision of a handful of America's finest, proving once again that in the shadows where freedom's battles are fought, numbers matter far less than the caliber of those who answer the call.